Hello, history lovers. Today we're going to talk about the second and probably best known wife of Henry VIII, and that is, of course, Anne Boleyn. She, she has the second part in the rhyme, naturally, and Horrible Histories has helped make this rhyme famous. And this verse is probably all that most people really know about her when you get down to it.
Young Anne Boleyn, she was two, had a daughter the best she could do. I said she flirted with some other man, and off with the chop went dear Anne.
While that much is accurate, it's way oversimplified, as with so much that kids are taught in history. I mean, it's amazing to look back on what kids learn in history class, what I remember learning in history class about Anne Boleyn, and that's pretty much the whole lesson on her. Now, I get that history teachers have a lot of years to cover, and just Henry VIII's reign alone covers a lot of years. So much else happened in the world at the time that it's hard to focus on just that, and especially on just one marriage. So I get why a lot of history is taught in a very simplified way, but there is so much more to the story than that. And even in Anne Boleyn's own time, there was a lot of mixed views on her, as historians still have today. You know, was she a home-wrecking temptress? Was she a victim of her time? Was she someone who tried to reach above her own station and ended up falling lower than any height she could ever have reached? Was she someone who ultimately fell victim to men controlling the lives of women at the time? Was she a schemer? Was she a victim? There's so many ways you can view her. And the truth is always a complicated thing. She wasn't any of those things, and yet she was all of those things. The bottom line is she was a smart, independent woman, especially given the standards of her time. She was somebody who did the best she could within the structure of that time. And she was also someone who was shaped by those times. Had she lived in the modern era, would she have had a completely different personality? Would she have had different life goals? Would she have gone about achieving her goals differently? Probably. Well, how she became the person she became started with her childhood and how she was raised, especially by her father, who was pretty ahead of the times and believed that all his children should have a good education, including his daughters.
In around 1513, the adolescent Anne was sent to Europe. Her father had secured her a place at the court of the Archduchess Margaret of Austria. It was a coup for Anne and the Boleyns. The court was regarded as the foremost finishing school for young ladies in Europe.
For Anne to have this opportunity is amazing, especially because young girls usually wouldn't have such a chance until they were at least 12. Anne's birth date is disputed, but she may have been younger at the time. But she really, really pleased everyone at court, and they even wrote letters to her father saying, "Thank you for sending her to us." She made an extremely good impression there. Well, it was sometime after this that her father had Anne go with Anne's sister Mary to France to attend Henry VIII's younger sister, who was about to be married to the King of France. And this had a lot of shaping to do on Anne's personality, too, especially given the women that she encountered at the time.
Anne remained exposed to this highly artistic, cultivated Renaissance court. And she was certainly exposed to some very powerful women, the Queen Mother of France, Louise of Savoy, for one, and would have been able to see how women of influence and power were able to operate for themselves. And I think that time was incredibly formative.
Anne spent 7 years in France learning the French way to do things. She learned the French style of dancing, French etiquette. In other words, she was becoming a bit exotic, something that Henry would later find highly desirable. But it wasn't Anne that Henry went for first. Both Anne and her sister Mary were recalled to England by their father, and Henry VIII happened to attend her sister Mary's wedding. Well, Henry was a little too fond of the bride, and Mary, Boleyn, and Henry had quite the affair. I don't. There's debate over just how exactly it started, but even more interestingly, there's a debate over whether Mary Boleyn's husband was the father of her children or was Henry. We don't know for sure. DNA tests haven't been done to conclude this. It's possible her father fathered her children, but it's also possible that they were Henry VIII's kids. Henry only acknowledged one illegitimate child his whole life. And that was Henry Fitzroy, his son by Bessie Blount. That doesn't mean that they weren't his, just that he didn't acknowledge them. Anne, meanwhile, fell in love with Henry or Harry Percy. His name's said different ways, but anyway, he was the one that Anne loved. But she'd caught Henry VIII's eye by this time, after Henry had grown tired of her sister. This meant that Anne wouldn't be able to marry the man she really wanted to marry. And she wasn't too keen to pick up on a relationship with Henry, especially with how he had dropped her sister.
Your voice! Do you know what it is to be in love, either of you? I love Harry Percy and will marry him.
Anne, you'll have us all dead or disgraced. Lower your voice. The royal bull can't force you.
Brother, I must fight, I must.
You know what it means when a king asks for you.
If I don't, I can ask my pregnant and foolish sister.
Anne and Henry Percy were actually secretly engaged. Until Henry Percy was shunned away, which of course Henry VIII had nothing at all to do with. Right. Henry VIII was going to make up for Anne's lover being sent away, though. He got her a nice job taking care of his wife as his wife's lady-in-waiting. In other words, Anne would be close at hand for him to have a little fun with her. Anne wanted nothing to do with this. She didn't want to be the third girl. She said, no, you want me? You're going to marry me, and that's the only way you're going to have me.
In the bed and the little one said, if you wanna be wed, make up your mind. Girl, me chum, don't wanna be some girl in a threesome. Are you blind?
Anne did as much as was possible to try to get Henry to back off. She left court to go back to her family's home at Hever Castle for a while, and Henry kept writing her letters that border on stalking, to be honest. He even said that he hoped to be kissing her lovely duckies soon. Duckies was a Tudor euphemism for breasts. So basically he's writing her letter saying, I want to kiss your boobs. She stays away from him as much as she can, but you really can't say no to the king.
She packed up her stuff, she headed back to Hever, she stayed with her mom. That's not playing hard to get, that is hard to get. The last thing that's going to happen is a courtier from the 1500s being able to tell Henry VIII, back off.
I think, unlike her sister, Anne never allowed her heart to rule her head.
Everybody knows, of course, that Henry VIII wanted a son, and his wife, Catherine of Aragon, was past childbearing years, and the only surviving child was a daughter, Mary. Well, because Catherine of Aragon had been married to Henry VIII's brother for a very, very short time before Henry's brother Arthur died, leaving Catherine a widow, Henry used that as an excuse to say that his marriage to Catherine wasn't valid. And he promised Anne, look, if we get together, I will marry you, you will be queen. And finally she said, okay, if you're going to marry me, I'll give in to this. But there was one more obstacle in their romance, and that was the dreaded sweating sickness. We don't know to this day what sweating sickness was. Was it a type of bacteria? Was it a virus? Was it a poisoning that was accidentally in food that wasn't prepared properly? Even today, we aren't sure just what the sweating sickness was. But it was terrifying, and you could go from healthy to dead in hours. So, when there was an outbreak of sweating sickness in London, Anne retreated to the country to try to stay safe, but she'd already been exposed and she did fall sick. And it says something that Henry sent his second best physician to attend to Anne. You may be thinking, second best? That doesn't sound all that great. But his best physician was actually unavailable. So the physician who would have been the best one to tend Henry actually sent to tend to Anne, which for Henry is very, very generous. So at the time, their love was going good. Well, everyone knows how it turned out. The annulment was not approved by the Catholic Church, so Henry just said, I'm going to make myself the head of the Church of England and grant my own annulment from Catherine. Then he had actually two marriages to Anne Boleyn. One was a secret marriage, and one was a public one. It's up for debate whether the first marriage is considered valid or not. But after the first secret marriage, Anne Boleyn became pregnant. And she was pregnant when she was coronated as queen and had her second wedding with Henry. Of course, that baby was not the son that Henry had longed for.
The birth of Elizabeth was a catastrophe. Yes, she was healthy. Yes, she was strong. But she was a girl. He'd been convinced it was a boy, and to him, it was an omen.
It made a mockery of everything he had gone through to marry Anne and to set aside his first wife, because the only reason that Anne would have been accepted by the population of England would have been if she'd given birth to a prince.
Anne was thoroughly hated by the people of England because she had replaced Catherine of Aragon, who everybody just loved, and with good reason. A lot of people support one or the other, but I see them both as women who did the best they could in their times. And Anne was about to have a lot more to deal with because Henry had cheated on Catherine, and he was going to cheat on Anne too. One of the reasons Anne didn't want to marry him in the first place because she knew this was going to happen. And unlike Henry's other mistresses, unlike Catherine, Anne wasn't going to just stay silent, and she spoke up about it. And that caused a lot of fighting between the two of them. Very public fighting, which Henry hated.
Refused to become the king's mistress no matter what. That's when you get all the stories of Anne's bad temper. Well, how she didn't just start stabbing Henry, I don't know.
One thing that was lucky for Anne was that she became pregnant very easily. But those babies just didn't make it. She became pregnant and miscarried, and it was shortly after this that Henry VIII started to have a little bit of, more than a little bit of a wandering eye towards Jane Seymour, who was one of Anne Boleyn's ladies-in-waiting, just like Anne Boleyn had been lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon. He gave Jane Seymour a pendant with a locket with his picture in, and there's a story that Anne actually ripped that necklace off of Jane's neck with so much force that Anne's fingers bled from it. Well, Anne became pregnant again, but this time things took another horrible turn, but it was Henry's fault. It wasn't just an accident. Henry was in a jousting match. He loved to joust, loved to show off what a man's man he was. Only he was unseated from his horse and the horse actually rolled over on him. He was unconscious for hours, and Anne was actually told that the injury was so severe that he was going to die, that Henry was going to die. This sent her into such shock that she miscarried. And she was just far enough along for it to be clear that the baby would have been a boy.
What is absolutely certain is the shock of hearing that Henry had this accident caused Anne Boleyn to miscarry a male child. Queen Anne was brought to bed and delivered of a man-child before her time. It was said she took a fright. It was a 3-month-old fetus, male child, perfectly formed, and if the child had lived, it could have been Henry's longed-for male heir.
It was said that Anne had miscarried of her savior, and Henry blamed her for the miscarriage, even though he'd been warned, Your Majesty, you might want to give up the jousting. You're not as young as you used to be. You're not as thin as you used to be. You might not want to go jousting anymore. Well, he didn't listen, wanted to be the big he-man, so... But of course, it was Anne's fault. But this was not the complete cause of her downfall the way many think. I was always taught in history class, Henry just wanted to get rid of her because she didn't give him a son and he wanted an excuse to marry Jane Seymour. True. But it wasn't only Henry involved in this. Anne had a lot of enemies at court. One of them was Thomas Cromwell. They had a lot of disagreements, him and Anne did. But the big one was about what to do with all the monasteries that Henry had claimed now that he was the head of the Church of England. Because all the monks who had lived there, they were out now, and Henry claimed everything that had been part of those monasteries as his own. Well, that was a lot of wealth. Question was, how should this best be used? Anne had some ideas, Cromwell had different ones, which led to the major part of their arguments. Henry was not loyal to anyone for very long. If anybody didn't agree with him, they were fired. Sounds like someone else I know today. Yeah, I mentioned that in my last video. Womanizer, got rid of anyone he didn't like, cheated on every wife he had. Yeah, I can't think of who that would be today. That slips my mind who I could compare that to, but in any case, Cromwell decided he'd better get rid of Anne. That was his best hope for survival.
At court, Cromwell puts the word out that he's sick, but Cromwell is far from sick. He is using this 2-week absence as the perfect cover for him to start plotting the downfall of his archenemy, Anne Boleyn. Cromwell has this incredibly sophisticated network of spies and informants.
Back then, they played a game called courtly love. Everybody in court flirted with everybody else, it was all just innocent joking around. Nobody really took it seriously. But it could be hard to tell sometimes whether you should take it seriously or not, and Cromwell was able to use this. Anne was very good at this game, but she made one terrible mistake that gave Cromwell a lot of fuel against her. Henry VIII being king made it treason to say that it was possible for him to die. Because being king, you can't die, right? Because kings are immortal, of course. Well, Anne was talking with yet another Henry Norris. Now, there's different versions of this story. Some say she was playing courtly love with him. Some say that she was arguing with him, telling him to back off his flirtation with her. But in any case, she made a remark something to the effect of, do you fancy yourself stepping into a dead man's shoes? In other words, if my husband were dead, would you have me? Well, she knew she'd made a mistake almost as soon as she said it, but it was too late. And Cromwell found this out. Rumors spiraled out of control that Anne was having an affair with Norris, that she was having an affair with a whole bunch of different guys, including her own brother George. Now, this was just plain ridiculous, but it gave Henry exactly the fuel he needed to get rid of Anne. There was a sham trial that everybody knew was a load of garbage, but there was nothing that could be done once Henry decided to have Anne arrested. The result was inevitable. Henry even played tennis while Anne was being executed, just to show how little he actually cared about her at this point.
Isn't playing tennis while your wife's being beheaded a little bit, well, heartless?
Heartless? I have gone out of my way to make things nice for her.
Nice?
Yes. I ordered the best swordsman in France to lop her head off. Got him in from Calais. Sharp sword, spared no expense.
There are stories that Henry did this as a mercy because the French swordsman was an expert and he would make Anne's death a lot less painful. Well, it was true that the swordsman was an expert. And according to all reports of the execution, it was quick and as painless as possible. But the swordsman had to come from France. And the only way he could have possibly gotten there on time for the execution was if he'd been sent for long before the trial. So it's pretty obvious the result was decided before Anne was even accused. Henry said that he wouldn't marry again unless his people demanded it, and he had a bunch of people say, "Oh yeah, we demand that you marry Jane Seymour. We would love it if you married her, Your Majesty." Yeah. Well, I'll be talking about Jane Seymour in my next video. And I invite you to interpret yourself what you think of Anne Boleyn. What kind of person you think she was. Myself, I find her a highly intelligent, fiery-spirited woman, and that, I think, was her biggest downfall. That was what I think frustrated Henry, where he expected Anne to be someone like Catherine of Aragon had been, someone who would turn a blind eye to his faults. Anne wasn't the type to do that. Anne was more than his equal. And I've often wondered why Henry just didn't divorce her the way he'd done with Catherine of Aragon. And I think it comes down to a question of pride. He had moved almost literally heaven and earth to marry Anne. And it hadn't gotten him what he wanted, and that was Anne's fault, of course. It's extremely tragic how she turned out, but I like to think that in some ways she knew that it was her daughter Elizabeth who would go on to become known as the greatest monarch England ever had. There's a wonderful book I'd like to recommend for anybody who is interested in Anne Boleyn or the Tudor era in general, and that is To Die For by Sandra Bird, spelled B-Y-R-D. To Die For tells the story of Anne Boleyn's rise and fall through the eyes of her best friend Meg Wyatt. I didn't know who Meg was before reading the book. I'd never heard of her, but she was a real person, and she'd actually been on the staff. She was actually on the scaffold with Anne Boleyn when she died. And there's a story that Anne gave Meg her personal prayer book, which does survive to this day. And the famous bee necklace that hangs around Anne's neck in the portraits of her that's made of pearls with a little bee pendant. Now, there's stories that this necklace was eventually given to Elizabeth. This story is disputed, but there are portraits of Elizabeth that show a necklace that's almost identical with just a slightly different pendant, which could easily have been altered because jewelry was often altered at that time. Rather than buy something in a different style, you reworked what you had. So I think it's possible that Elizabeth did get that necklace from Meg Wyatt, and there's a story that the 3 bottom pearls that hang under the bee of that famous necklace are part of the crown today. We don't exactly know what Anne Boleyn looks like. The portraits we have of her were painted after her lifetime, but from what people have described her in writings, the portrait matches pretty close, so I've been to England and I've seen the portraits of her, and I've also been to the Tower of London where it's said that she haunts to this day. So, like I said, to sum up, I find her fascinating. She can be seen a lot of different ways, and I invite you to learn more about her and make your own interpretation of who she was for yourself. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you in my next video.